So last year, I attended COP26 in Glasgow, where rain fell about as freely as the tears from the face of, well, our COP minister, Alok Sharma, when the deal fell through, when China and India went, don't really feel like scrapping coal power all that quickly, thank you very much. This year, some political leaders, ambassadors, and unelected international bodies will convene in the climate-conscious state of Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, where most people go on holiday. Lovely. But just like last year, our self-appointed elites, jet-setting hypocrisy, and scarcely veiled attempts to immiserate and enslave us are on full display. So let's look at some of their stupid proposals from the inaugural day, suggested as our path to energy insecurity, shall we? First of all, speaking of our elites sending us senselessly to our deaths, if you'd like to subscribe to the website, you can watch our Epochs series, this one on the Armistice, ahead of Armistice Day on Friday. Bo and Carl did a very good job of discussing the events leading up to the end of the war and some particularly emotive aspects of, well, the brave young men who died pretty senselessly in trenches. And Bo had a wonderful reading of a war poem at the end, which I really have to commend him on. And I'm glad I worked with the guy because he's very lovely. So first of all, let's go to the fact that COP is being sponsored by Coca-Cola, the #1 plastics producer in the world. Now, I do like to laugh at this sort of stuff, right? But for me, and as you said, you've done some radio and bits and pieces before, so I don't know which stations you specifically did, but as someone who frequents GB News and Talk TV a fair bit, I am kind of bored about the, but they're using private jets argument, because, yeah, of course they are. They don't give us any moral consideration. We are the little people. Yeah. So our hypocrisy charges are just going to fall on deaf ears. They don't really care.
The rules don't really apply to them, do they?
No, absolutely not. So I do think pointing out hypocrisy is very useful to show the uninitiated or the sort of fence-sitters on the climate debate that it's not really about saving the planet. It's about immiserating us, controlling us, making sure that they are enriched at our expense. But I do think that it's pretty useless to keep going, you're all hypocrites, you should change your ways, because they don't want to change their ways, because it's not about moral consistency. It's about them getting fat and happy and us being poor and cold and easily predictably controlled. So as much as Coca-Cola, it's fun to point out, make a lot of plastic every year, that's the point. They're all in it together. So not to dunk on James Melville, because he puts out some good stuff, but it's going to fall on deaf ears, I'm afraid. There's also their menu at the event. So do you remember when Patrick Vallance, the guy who basically locked us down for 2 years, turned around and said, we need behavioural changes like abandoning meat to save climate change? There's little nudge things. Turns out all of the global elite who are going to this thing, when they land in Sharm el-Sheikh for the 12-day conference, they're going to be able to taste Angus beef medallions with sautéed potatoes for £100. £90, $100. Creamy salmon for $35, $40, sorry, £35, get my currencies mixed up here. And also seafood platters for £43. They can get a after-dinner tipple bag for £43, including beer, red and white wines, all imported, of course. And for those who like dessert, they can pay £110 for 90 minutes of bottomless cocktails. So very climate-conscious meals here. Definitely not just having a piss up at our expense whatsoever. If we can go to the next one. Again, the charge of hypocrisy, we're not going to open this video and play it, but we're all just going to let it go in the background. I'll describe it for you. Sky News put up a warning saying, warning, protesters hit by military police in this. Basically, a couple of hundred environmental activists stormed Amsterdam airport and sat in front of private jets to stop them taking off to go to COP. And I'm kind of happy for the climate fanatics to sit there and eat their own because they get dragged off, and while they're beating drums, they're beaten with batons, and they didn't actually ground any commercial flights. So it didn't get in the way of us little people going on holiday, of course. But I have to question, why are you protesting this in the first place when the entire global elite are on your side? You're essentially the foot soldiers of the regime that think that your policies are a foregone conclusion. And we can see that these policies are a foregone conclusion if we look at our appointed, not elected, Prime Minister's statement. If we go to the next one, this is a speech he gave yesterday, and I'm just going to read a little bit from it. It's mainly waffle. People criticising him not being harsh enough, right? But there's really one key part here. Climate security goes hand in hand with energy security. I agree. Putin's abhorrent war in Ukraine and rising energy prices across the world are not a reason to go slow on climate change, they're a reason to act faster. Right. Does anyone happen to remember, and I'm sure that they do, but they just don't care, they're using it as an excuse, it's a controlled demolition. But does anyone remember exactly what got Germany hooked on Nord Stream pipelines in the first place? That's right, it was the decommissioning of their nuclear power plants by 2022, an attempt to go wholesale renewables, and then, boom, rolling blackouts, which resulted in some people dying because some hospitals didn't have backup generators.
Going all in on Russian gas and then cancelling that as well.
Yeah.
But no, that's interesting, actually. So if these protesters glue themselves to the road while we're trying to get to work, police are all nicey-nicey. But if you go and block the private jets, then batons come out.
That's a very valid point.
How curious.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how it only matters if you inconvenience the elite who already agree with you anyway? So Sunak then says, there are reasons to act faster, because diversifying our energy supplies by investing in renewables is precisely the way to ensure ourselves against the risks of energy dependency. It's also a fantastic source of new jobs and growth. Well, we'll be seeing slightly later why renewables quite aren't up to the task, but I don't see how anyone is surprised by him doubling down on the green-only dogma, because even though he moments ago said that he wouldn't be going to COP, last year he made this pretty extraordinary promise. Let's just compare his speech, shall we? He says, I wanted to rewire the entire global financial system for net zero. So, quite an ambitious scope to moralise markets via the legislature. And this includes measures such as, and obviously your background in finance, you may be able to identify the exact kind of ideology that is parasitising businesses with these kind of tenants, but he says, better and more consistent climate data, sovereign green bonds, mandatory sustainability disclosures, proper climate risk surveillance, and stronger global reporting standards.
I suspect there's going to be another one in there, which he hasn't mentioned, which is considerably more bungs to landowners for hosting wind turbines and solar panels. That's probably going to be where actually most of the money is going to end up.
See, it's funny because I was in a Zoom call with Bim Afalami, who's one of the business ministers. I don't know if he's still appointed now, but they were discussing after the National Tree Strategy released about how government can incentivise more landowners to plant more trees to offset more carbon. And he kind of interrupted and just went, we hear a lot of talk about incentives, but we have the laws. Why don't we just force them to do it? And it is interesting that it could be the case, as the Dutch government are seeming to do, for example, with their sudden scaremongering about nitrogen emissions, but instead they just want to seize land to either build on it or create new wind turbines.
Well, that applies to our boilers, for example. So, I mean, the government have decided that they're just going to ban us from buying non-EV cars after 2035.
Yes.
They've decided that they're going to ban us from having the type of boilers that we might like to have. So they have no issue using compulsion whenever they want to, except when it comes to landowners, when it has to be incentives.
Yeah, yet. And that's the point. We have no moral prohibition against them just confiscating your land. It's just a matter of time. But for me, this reads a lot like ESG's instantiated into law by the British government on a global scale. So you have to report your sustainability record. You have to report your carbon labelling. You have to basically buy climate change insurance from the power brokers who are selling it to you based on scaremongering projections that aren't even in the IPCC. I mean, there's this book here, right? I'm going through it at the moment. We're hoping to get Alex on the show eventually at the start of the year, Fossil Future. And he does go through the fact that in the IPCC report, when they talk about floods, storms, droughts, the IPCC said it's either so strenuous to link it to human activity that it's utterly improbable, or the results were at least inconclusive. So everyone turning around and saying, oh, Germany, oh, Pakistan, no, you're pulling it out your backside.
Well, and also I know that they keep talking about these sort of floods and they talk about rising sea levels. Yet every bank in the world is still perfectly happy to lend 30-year mortgages on coastal properties, such as the one that Obama recently bought.
Yeah.
So why is it that these banks with their large risk departments are perfectly willing to go against the green ideology which they claim to sign up for?
Well, it's also interesting that Bill Gates decides to import Caribbean sand via shipping crate every year to his own private household beach. But meanwhile, we have to eat 100% synthetic beef. Isn't that interesting? Sunak is making good on his promise, though. This is from Harry Cole. I believe he's the political editor of The Sun, off the top of my head. And he's noticed that recently, Sunak has scrapped Liz Truss, shortest Prime Minister in history, Foreign Policy and Security Council, and restored the National Security Council. But he's also added a new National Security Council on Europe that has removed Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, in charge of migration policy. So the National Security Council, which deals with Europe, is not including the woman who is meant to be dealing with the influx of Channel migrants from Calais. The most revealing thing, though, and this is why I've linked it to COP, is because Jeremy Hunt, the again appointed Chancellor that no one wanted, and he's compromised by China, see our segment for that, now chairs the Home Affairs Committee, which covers economic policy. If you can scroll down to the second tweet just here, John. This standalone climate committee is also gone, and it's swallowed into the Domestic and Economic Affairs Energy, Climate and Net Zero Committee. So that means that Sunak, within Cabinet, has folded net zero concerns, climate policy, into economic policy wholesale, and Hunt now chairs that. Isn't that interesting? Basically, the entire reorientation of our domestic finance policy at a time of recession is going towards the green transition.
Well, and funny, because normally what this means is that they are going to be pursuing policies that they know that the public don't support.
Yes.
But if they wrap them up in the green agenda, then they can bypass that buy-in.
Yeah, well, it's the realization of the fourth industrial revolution with COVID as an excuse. I wonder where they got that idea from, shall we? So let's talk about the lone positive that may have come from COP26 so far, shall we? And this was already in the works with Liz Truss and Biden beforehand. Not that Biden remember whose he spoke to about 5 minutes ago, let alone the last Prime Minister, but Rishi Sunak has basically struck a deal with the US, to all of our US viewers over there, thank you very much, to ease Britain's energy crisis. And the idea is to have the US be the UK's primary oil and gas exporter. So they're promised to export billions of cubic meters of liquefied natural gas to the UK, sources have told The Telegraph. The UK hopes the figure will be around 10 billion cubic meters, according to UK sources. The whole of the European Union was promised 15 billion cubic meters by the US this spring, so we're outdoing those guys. It would also provide reassurance on UK energy supply. The National Grid has warned of blackouts this winter between 4 and 7 p.m. The Guardian reported a little while ago that the BBC have actually drafted their briefings for, if we can go back please, John, their briefings for winter blackouts announcements to be read on air in January. It's unclear how much of the gas, which will be sold by US companies rather than the US government, of course, but they are currently having a stranglehold on the licenses and leasing. Obviously, Biden signed all those executive orders blocking new federal oil and gas leases and drilling on federal lands. It's unclear how much of it will reach the UK energy system for winter. It may just drip feed into the new year. The interesting thing, though, I don't want to be raining on the parade, but this could be shut down in one of two ways, because they're also partnering more on renewables technologies, and the Biden administration are emphasizing the renewables half of this deal. So I think what may happen is, with the Republicans winning the midterms possibly today, because it will be a safe and secure election, what will happen is that the Republicans will turn around, rightly concerned about American national security, and go, well, hang on a minute, Biden, we've had 2 years of him stopping gas drilling, therefore the prices are up, so our internal gas markets are screwed up, so we can't afford to export at this time, therefore we'll put this deal on hold for a little while. And I would understand that, but also we'll be very cold as well. And then that will be the excuse for the Democrats to turn around and go, okay, we can at least help them with the renewables aspect of the deal, and they will double down on the policy they'd already agreed on was destined for us anyway.
Well, that's very possible, and even if that's not the case, the only reason why the US is in the position to export some of this liquid natural gas in the first place is because they've been getting so heavily into fracking. So effectively what the UK government is saying is that we can't have fracking here, but what we can do is we can buy American fracking product only with a markup and a transportation cost added on top. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, it definitely makes sense when you realise that the fracking vote and the attempts to whip the party members into shape behind the scenes was the catalyst to Liz Truss's final nail in the coffin resignation. And it's definitely that there seems to be a foregone conclusion within the Tory party that there is a micromanagerial international state ideology at work with at least half of them, and they don't like it when someone upsets the apple cart a little bit.
At least half.
Yes. The other half seem to be more internationalist warmongers, but bless you. So, speaking of our Prime Minister in waiting, shall we? The guy who's going to inevitably take over at this rate, because the Tories are committing suicide if we don't murder them with the general election, and, well, two pigs, different colour rosettes. Keir Starmer's authored this piece. It was in The Observer originally, but it's been reprinted in The Guardian. It says that it is said that Britain is not in the business of showing climate leadership on the world stage. That is because of Sunak's weak position. The Prime Minister's first priority will always be the basest instincts of the Conservative Party. What fiction is he peddling? They are all on board with net zero. For the Tories, it's always party first. What's best for the country and for the planet comes a distant second. It's time for a fresh start, one that recognises the crisis we face are linked and will only be solved by a new approach. The UK's energy bills disaster was exacerbated by Putin's grotesque invasion of Ukraine, but it was caused by 12 years of failure by Tory governments to unhook Britain from its dependence on fossil fuels. Now, that is in part true, because 12 years of Tory rule, also in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, which we'll get onto later, have basically sabotaged Britain's energy independence by Theresa May selling off our shale gas reserves, the reluctance to build new nuclear power, the partnership with China on new nuclear power stations, the unwillingness to up North Sea oil and gas drilling, which Kwasi Kwarteng also wanted to do suspiciously, and then he was ousted again. But then what do you reckon his solution is going to be? What do you think Labour's big throbbing brain idea will be for this?
No idea, do tell.
At the same time, we have an accelerating climate crisis, illustrated most recently by the devastating floods in Pakistan and Britain's first 40-degree day, so he's calling it apocalyptic situation caused by fossil fuels. It's why I have set out a world-leading commitment for Britain to be the first major economy to reach 100% clean power by 2030. So 100% renewables in 8 years.
Utter fantasy.
The ambition of those plans is matched only by my determination to deliver them. Under my Labour government, the UK will become a clean energy superpower. And he wants to establish a national wealth fund and GB Energy, a publicly owned energy company, to invest in the technologies and the jobs of the future. From green hydrogen to floating wind turbines, gigafactories to new nuclear, clean steel to tidal power, with a Labour government, new industries will thrive. Now, he's going to have to overcome a lot of the anti-nuclear sentiment in his base to get any nuclear on the docket. I think it's going to end up just being 100% renewables anyway, and that was actually the Green Party position, has been for quite a while, the Extinction Rebellion position as well, and that's become the mainstream talking point of both parties, the Conservatives and Labour. We'll demonstrate exactly what the Conservatives think about that shortly, but just to prove I'm not making it up, and the Green Party do really want 100% renewables. Their energy party policy, tenets 10 and 11. They say, in line with the move from fossil fuels, clean electricity generation will be substantially increased, based primarily on renewables, very low carbon sources, with offshore wind as a major source, supported by onshore wind, marine, solar, photovoltaic, biofuels, hydropower, and geothermal. So no nuclear in there at all. I remember Caroline Lucas also saying that we don't need nuclear power. So actively just sabotaging our energy system, because you need a dispatchable baseload to consistently run in the background when the weather isn't opportune, when the sun doesn't shine and the winds don't blow, and also because battery storage power just isn't there yet, which we'll get onto in a minute. But what happens if we either generate a surplus that we don't need, or if we are in a deficit and our neighbours have better weather? Well, it turns out that point 11 on this, it says that continuity of supply will be ensured by using the UK's renewable energy sources and a variety of storage technologies and links to other countries' grids. So every country is going to have undersea cables interconnecting them, you know, like a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And we're going to be dependent on each other, holding hands and singing Kumbaya and sharing power when we all have either generated too much or not enough.
Well, and that's essentially how we got into the problem that we're in now, because that energy plan, the balancing factor at the end of it is that we can just buy energy off our neighbours. Well, it turns out that everybody else had that in their energy plan as well. And when there's an energy shortage, there isn't actually any spare energy left.
There's a finite supply, and especially because the tech just isn't there yet. So we can go on to the next one. Just a little bit of research I did a little while ago. If you think renewables are up to scratch to be adopted wholesale by 2030, I've got a bridge to sell you. My modelling for the Adam Smith Institute found that if the average energy production rate of renewables, which at the time of 2021 was 7.76 gigawatts, and that became the sole source for Britain's national grid, it would fall short of meeting existing average consumer energy demand, 30 gigawatts, by 74.5%. And obviously with the rise of remote work and the like, that's only going to go up, especially with the use of electric cars and the increasing digitisation of things like gas hobs into induction hobs. So we're just going to need more and more energy. Also, if wind and solar were to double their grid contributions, it would cost consumers, before inflation, an increase by £10 for every single megawatt hour of power. So, utterly unaffordable for households. That's if the generation could also be stabilised enough to be reliable. Last year's weekly peak for renewables production was 46.4 gigawatts. Its deepest trough, a 21-day stretch of 15.5 gigawatts. So that's half the average energy demand for 21 days. To expand the grid capacity to be able to store enough energy generated renewably to make up for those 21-day deficits, which, by the way, the batteries aren't there yet. It's gotten to the point where they're trying to store it in sand silos, like it's the pig silo from the Simpsons movie. That's not going to work. To store 7,560 gigawatts to safeguard against these 15-day-long generation troughs would cost £2.9 trillion, which is more than the UK's annual GDP, of course. Again, before inflation, so that's going to go up. A feat was also to require the redirection of global battery manufacturing capacity from now to 2030 itself to be directed just to the UK and just for the grid. So no one can have any electric cars, no one can generate their own renewables. Phones are kind of a problem.
It's simply not a question of cost. It's that the lithium refining doesn't exist. All the way down the chain you go. All of the base elements that you need in order to get to this point, the capacity simply isn't there. So you can throw as much money at this as you like. It's simply impossible.
Yeah, and also the places that do have the lithium, like Afghanistan, which we just abandoned, the 140 countries in China's Belt and Road Initiative, like Zimbabwe or Argentina, where they have whole salt flats full of lithium. China now owns those. And we were exporting lithium and precious metals out of a couple of countries a little while ago, but they seem to have gotten in a bit of a kerfuffle. Oh, Russia and Ukraine, of course. Sure, it's all down to Putin and not the fact that we outsourced all of our energy needs to our enemies. So, if we can just explain why we're in this mess. Nick Clegg, back in 2010, explained why government policy has put us in this place. We can play this clip.
By the most optimistic scenarios from the government itself, there's no way they're going to have new nuclear come on stream until about 2021, 2022. So it's just not even an answer.
Great. Thanks. So because you thought 10 years was too many years away, we're now living in that time, and we're cold, and things are very costly. So cheers, you corrupt git. Thanks very much. And as Adam points out, the short-termism of our current system is quite literally killing people. Yeah. Fantastic. Speaking of awful 2010s politics, guess who decided to pipe up about COP? It's the Shadow Climate Secretary himself, Ed Miliband, failed Labour leader. Do you remember in 2014 when he did his Ed Stones? Giant tablets of his policies, and item 4 had controls on immigration. Well, this is how quickly the conversation has sprinted leftward of the Overton window. He's actually suggesting global climate reparations. I'm going to subject you to this clip, and I'm sorry in advance.
To go back to COP, part of the debate is going to be about the richer part of the world paying the poorer part of the world to help them deal with carbon costs. And some people even call it reparations. Essentially, wealthy countries ought to be giving money to countries that are finding the impact of climate change very profound and difficult. Would a Labour government pay reparations to developing countries for climate change?
I don't see it as about reparations. And actually, when you talk to lots of campaigners, they don't either. This is about the issue of so-called loss and damage. This is the fact that poorer countries are facing massive effects of climate change. You know, we see it all around the world. We see it,
and we can quibble about the terminology.
Well, no, the terminology matters because lots of people are allergic to the term reparations.
Our viewers will want to know also if a Labour government would transfer large amounts of cash to the developing world, including to China. Would Labour give money to China?
It's not about China. No, it's not about China.
So you wouldn't?
I don't think China isn't necessarily asking for money. Look, this is about poorer countries that are on the front line of the climate crisis. Pakistan had these disastrous floods recently, 30% of the country underwater. So this is about global solidarity. I mean, yes, we have some historical responsibility, but this is about global solidarity, and it's absolutely part of our aid commitment. You know, we don't think the government was right to cut the 0.7 aid commitment.
But so you would, just to be clear, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but to be clear, a Labour government would give that money.
Absolutely, it's about supporting poorer countries, completely right. And let me just say, it's morally right, Laura, but it's also in our self-interest too. Because if we don't act and if we don't help countries around the world, we're going to end up with the problems that countries face in terms of refugees, for example, coming back onto us.
Except that China is part of the group of countries that is asking for loss and damage, to use the COP terminology.
We should recognise loss and damage, absolutely.
Including
but
for a country with as much money for China.
It's not about giving money to China. I promise you, Laura, it's not about giving money to China. That's not what this is about. This is about countries like the Maldives, like Pakistan and others. And we have aid commitments. Now, unfortunately, the government has resiled from many of our aid commitments, but it is absolutely about recognising our moral responsibility.
Right, it will be absolutely about giving money to China, 100%. When he says global solidarity, that just translates to redistributive international climate communism. And also, I don't want to work for the rest of my life, so you can tax me to death, so we can pay Pakistan, a nation which stones rape victims to death, for their floods and their inability to prep for them because they're a corrupt hellhole.
And actually, it's worse than that, because he did hit upon an interesting point there. He talked about the fact that it was money going to these poor countries to sort of stop a refugee crisis. Well, current Western policy, like I said, because everybody's run out of energy, what they're doing is they're basically bidding up the cost of energy that they can get in. So that means that Western nations are taking whatever little amount of energy fuels are available, and it's not going to those third world countries. So there isn't enough diesels for countries like Sri Lanka and other places in order to run their agricultural equipment. So current Western energy policy of bidding out for all the energy that is available is going to result, and is starting to result now, in famine across the third world, which will result in another wave of immigration that will be coming this way, which I'm sure the government will be only too happy to accommodate.
Yeah, it just so happens that all of the policies the global elite are pursuing at the same time they're concerned about global population levels happen to result in a lot of deaths. How weirdly convenient
immigration.
that is. Yeah. Speaking of China, funnily enough, it came out today that China has emitted more CO2 over the past 8 years than the UK has since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So why the hell should we be paying them when we're 1% of all emissions? And by my numbers that I found last year, China opened 252 coal power plants to exceed capacity, and that would add 16% to total global emissions by 2030, when we're trying to eliminate 1% by 2050. So that's just suicide. Between 1750 and 2020, the UK emitted 78 billion tonnes of CO2, whereas China put out 80 billion tonnes since 2013. They're only outpaced by the US. But of course, under President Trump, the guy who withdrew from the Paris Accords, evil climate denier he is, oh yeah, year on year, due to fracking, they actually became the leading nation to decrease their emissions, and they became energy independent all at once. I wonder why they got rid of him. So we laugh at this proposal. Rishi Sunak's actually doing this. He's doing it. Let's go to the next one. Sunak has announced that due to their key funding commitments, they're spending $11.6 billion on international climate finance, recognising the existential threat climate change is already opposing around the world, from catastrophic floods in Pakistan to the drought in Somalia. Again, no evidence that climate change caused either of those. The government will commit to triple funding for climate adaptation as part of that budget, from $500 million in 2019 to $1.5 billion in 2025. The projects include new and expanded solar and geothermal power plants in Kenya, backed by British international investment, UK export financing for Nairobi's ground-breaking railway city, etc., etc. They're trying to compete with China's Belt and Road scheme. Whereas, personally, I wouldn't send Pakistan so much as a pool noodle, even if they were neck-deep underwater. I don't care. No. Nicola Sturgeon's doing the same thing, again with our money, because the Scottish economy is in a shambles.
And I find it interesting that when Liz Truss tried to cut taxes by around about the same amount of money, it apparently caused a crisis that resulted in her having to go. But when that money's being used for international subsidies, then that's okay.
Isn't it really interesting that we had 2 years of literal economic crash engineered by the man who is now occupying Downing Street, and the Bank of England didn't blink a bloody eye because he was on board with digital currencies? But Liz Truss goes, I'm going to cut your tax by 1%, and oh boy, we couldn't possibly do that.
Some might say problem, reaction, solution.
Yes, some might say coup. Nicola Sturgeon just said she's going to announce another $5 million of reparations, taking the total to $7 million that could be used by developing countries to address the, quote, direct impact of climate change or non-economic effects such as, direct quote, loss of cultural identity. Sorry, can I start claiming for that? The amount of mass migration you've inflicted on me, because my country doesn't look exactly like it was. I'm going to start calling migrants climate change. Here's why we can't have absolute monarchy, to prorogue this terrible parliament as well. Remember when King Charles was told, don't go? Yeah, he decided to do his own mini-COP at home instead. Great. He's not on our side, lads. He literally gave the keynote speech at the WEF in 2020, so as much as we will take any solution to a bad parliament at this point, he's not going to provide it. And lastly, speaking of climate communism, let's look at Greta Thunberg, who actually isn't going to COP27 this year, so all the attendees get a break from being told, how dare you. She's calling for system-wide transformation at her book launch in London. She said, we are never going back to normal again because normal was already a crisis. What we refer to as normal is an extreme system built on the exploitation of people and the planet. It is a system defined by colonialism, imperialism, oppression and genocide by the so-called global north to accumulate that wealth that still shapes our current world order. Released last week, the book includes around 100 contributions from various climate experts. Some of these will turn your stomach, including writer Naomi Klein, socialist, Tedros Adhanom, I'm not even going to pronounce his last name, the guy who heads up the World Health Organization, literal party communist, and Thomas Piketty from The Economist, and apparently he's a French materialist who's proposed a global tax on wealth to reduce income inequality. So a bunch of commies just endorsing her open. When asked by Miss Ahmed whether she thought it would be as simple as making laws that outlaw things, she responded, there are many things that we can do, but while we do these things that we can do within our current system, we have to realise that we need a system-wide transformation. That sounds like the kid. Do you know the meme of, do you think that, do you think that, did you ever have a dream that, Wonderful nonsense, predictive text. We need to change everything because right now our current system is on a collision course with the future of humanity and the future of civilization. I don't know why we're actually surprised that Greta's saying this now, though, because a couple of years ago she published this article that not many people know about in Project Syndicate that says school children, young people and adults all over the world will stand together demanding that our leaders take action, not because we want them to, but because the science demands it. That action must be powerful and wide-ranging. After all, the climate crisis is not just about the environment, it's a crisis of human rights, of justice, and of political will, very Rousseauian. Colonial, racist, and patriarchal systems of oppression have created and fueled it. We need to dismantle them all. Right, so she's always been a climate commie, and you guys just didn't notice. Frankly, I would rather burn tyres in my front garden than give Greta what she wants. The problem is, all of this ideology leads to one place, and I just thought I'd finish with this. Now, he didn't endorse this, the Oxford academic. He was merely explaining it. But this kind of climate utilitarianism, this indifference to human life shown by Just Stop Oil blocking ambulances, leads to this kind of genocidal rhetoric. You shouldn't save people if they're drowning because they eat meat, and the ultimate harm is done more to chickens at a battery farm than this one person dying. That is going to be the ideology of the Malthusian, misanthropic, climate activists and the elites that agree with them in the end. And again, I just so hope it's a coincidence that all of these policies result in more deaths and they're not deliberately trying to engineer lower population. I hope they're just stupid and we can convince them out of it. So I suppose I'll just wrap up with we can at best hope that COP is a flop, because if it's successful, we'll be living under the leatherless boot heel of the climate cultists, won't we?
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the premium articles we do, this one on what use is the Department of Education, with an audio track for silver and gold tier members. And if you'd like to check out what else we're putting out, you can follow us on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.